Hello. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about some knowledge that the ancients had, as well as evidence that proves that humans have been around a long, long time, much further, much longer than what the church would traditionally tell you. Now, traditionally, the church would tell you that Adam was created at 4004 BC. All this is based erroneously on a genealogical study done by Bishop Ussher. Now, Bishop Ussher was a medieval monk who did some genealogical research through the genealogies in the Bible. The error with that, the problem with that, is that trying to do or determine the age of this earth, or even when Adam was created using genealogies, just don't pan out. In the lists of father and son, and this guy begat this guy, and this guy begat this guy, and that's what he used to do his reckoning. The problem with that is that sometimes sons could be grandsons, or they could be great grandsons, and with people living 7, 8, 900 years before the flood, and you skip several generations, well, then you can create a really, really long time that Adam was created long before 4004 BC. So, whenever you hear that assumption, just bear in mind that it's based on an erroneous genealogical study done by a medieval monk. I've gone through and I've done that, and I've come up with about the same date, and you could do it as well. Like I say, but the problem is that they skip generations in these genealogical lists that you have in the Bible. Science is now proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that man was here even earlier than the Ice Age. The Ice Age ended around 9000 BC, 11,000 years ago. That's when the final meltdown of the glacial areas of the earth occurred. And interestingly, I was in watching America Unearthed. They were talking about comparing the Clovis, the American Indian, the Native Americans, that originally came from Asia across the Bering Strait land bridge. These are called the Clovis people, and science have determined that this was about 15,000 years ago, and most of your archaeologists and scientists will say that these are the first people to arrive in the Americas. But there's been more discoveries that tends to blow that theory away. In Florida, 1982, at the Wendover Bog, which is a kind of a pond, a boggy pond, and a bog just means there's layers and layers of peat. But with the pH levels and with the low oxygen levels within this water, it leads to a great area to preserve bodies or preserve skeletons of these people and DNA. And what even the Smithsonian is agreeing with is that these people, along with relics that are found, that even the Clovis people used, were actually almost identical to what the Solutrean peoples who lived in France or in Europe had migrated to the United States over 20,000 years ago. They found a flint artifacts in Virginia that is identical to what the Clovis people and the Solutreans would use, but the flint itself is directly from France. So this particular stone came from France. The finds from these bog people also the DNA shows, as far as what the Smithsonian says, it shows that these people came from Europe. Now, also interestingly, and this wasn't in the show, I've heard it somewhere back, I forget where, but I think it may have been in America, BC, Barry Fell, that the Native Americans all across the United States, the further west you go, these people have more of an Asian characteristics. And on the eastern seaboard, they have more leaning towards more European characteristics. So the Clovis people and the Solutreans all came from both sides of the world. One from the Clovis from Asia, around 15,000 years ago, and the Solutreans well earlier than 20,000 years ago. And the Native Americans then are the direct descendants from both of these peoples, with the eastern side of the Americas having more European characteristics and out west in America more Asian characteristics. And these things are very, very interesting because if you hold fast to what the church has traditionally told you, then you're wrong. You're in error. This world's been around a long, long, long time. Mankind has been around a long time. Homo sapiens sapiens, our particular, the people of this world now, that's our designation, has been around for around 50,000 years ago. But how does this all fit in the Bible, and does this seem to destroy what the biblical record says and whatnot? So that's what all this is about. Now, bear in mind too, these Native Americans are still fairly primitive as far as the things that that we know that they've done. Making stone tools and things like that. But there's also some ancient knowledge that's preserved here in South America that indicates a great intellect. And that's what we're going to talk about also a little bit today, that there was a great intellect that preserved monuments, that preserved knowledge of the ancients, knowledge of the universe, knowledge of geometry and archaeology, the dimensions of the earth, aspects of our solar system that we're only beginning to understand these things now. And only because we're able to understand these things, we're able to decipher what these ancients depicted in their monuments. And we'll get into a little more about that. But I did find those shows very interesting, and I recommend those shows. I want you to bear in mind, though, as you're watching these shows, that just because they're attributing certain knowledge that's incorporated into these buildings and pyramids and the lineups of the certain aspects of their buildings, all of these things aren't necessarily attributed to alien extraterrestrials, but they could be attributed to God. Now, Josephus stated that the descendants of Seth It says that they also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies, and that their order, and that their inventions might not be lost upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire and at another time by the violence and quantity of water. They made two pillars, one of brick, the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries upon them both, that in the case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain and exhibit these discoveries to mankind, and also informed them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. And also, when John Greaves visited Egypt in the 17th century, he collected ancient local traditions which attributed the construction of the pyramids at the Giza Plateau, the three pyramids there, to a mythical antediluvian king. And this is what they say, that the occasion of this was because he saw in his sleep that the whole earth was turned over, with the inhabitants of it lying upon their faces and the stars falling down and striking one another with terrible noise. And he awaked with great fear and assembled the chief priests and the provinces of all the provinces of Egypt. He related the whole matter to them, and they took the altitude of the stars and made their prognostications and foretold of a deluge. The king said, "Will it come to our country?" And they answered, "Yes, it will destroy it." And there remained a certain number of years to come. And he commanded in the mean space to build the pyramids. And he engraved in these pyramids all things that were told by wise men, as also all profound sciences, the science of astrology, and of arithmetic, and of geometry, and of the physique, I guess. All this may be interpreted by him who knows their characters and language. I showed in the Great Pyramid Letter and my podcast some ancient knowledge of the astronomy and how these things were lined up. So I'm reading right now from Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. And that title may throw you a bit, but actually in Genesis, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. El is a singular form of deity. Elohim is a plural form of deity. So, in the beginning, gods created the heavens and the earth. I won't really get into the particulars on that. The Trinity could be a solution to that, or with Jesus being the creative aspect of God that spoke these worlds into existence. You have God the Father and God the Son for sure, and that's plural, and that could be part of it as well. But also, people need to realize that Satan was on this earth. Lucifer, before he fell, was on this earth, and there were meeting places of intelligent beings. Jeremiah sees this. He sees this earth become a waste and desolation. And that, along with when he tells Adam and Eve to replenish the earth, indicates that it had been plenished before. And there are other things. For instance, Adam says, "Henceforth shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. They shall be one flesh." How did he know what a father and mother or kids were if there hadn't been any? So all of these little clues lead you to believe that there was something prior to Adam and his descendants, our ancestor Adam. So, but right now we're going to read a few things out of this book. Now, this is a pretty awesome book. It gives us many evidences of a superior knowledge that the ancients had, and that they built into constructions and certain things of this earth that are preserved, and these knowledge of the ancients indicate that they were here a long First, from out of Chapter 1, is called A Map of Hidden Places. The 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, SAC, United States Air Force, Westover Air Force Base, Massachusetts. And this letter was written in July 6 of 1960. Their subject is the Admiral Piri Reis World Map. It's written to Professor Charles H. Hapgood at Keene College in Keene, New Hampshire. Dear Professor Hapgood, your request for evaluation of certain unusual features of the Piri Reis World Map of 1513 by this organization has been reviewed. The claim that the lower part of the map portrays the Princess Martha Coast of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, and the Palmer Peninsula is reasonable. We find this is the most logical and in all probability the correct interpretation of the map. The geographical detail shown on the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. This indicates the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. The ice cap in this region is now about a mile thick. We have no idea how the data on this map can be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513. And it was signed Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, Commander. Now, conventional wisdom has it that the Antarctic ice cap in its present extended form is millions of years old. But on a closer examination, this notion turns out to be seriously flawed. So seriously that we need not assume the map drawn by Admiral Piri Reis depicts Queen Maud Land as it looked millions of years in the past. The best recent evidence suggests that Queen Maud Land and the neighboring region shown on the map passed through a long ice-free period which may not have come completely to an end until about 6,000 years ago. This evidence liberates us from the burdensome task of explaining who or what had the technology to undertake an accurate geographical survey of Antarctica in, say, 2 million BC, long before our own species came into existence. By the same token, since map making is a complex and civilized activity, it compels us to explain how such a task could have been accomplished even 6,000 years ago, well before the development of the first true civilizations recognized by historians. Now, this Piri Reis map, here's the original, and on the right side of the map you have the western coast of Africa. On the left side of the map you have the eastern coast of South America, and on the bottom of the map you have the coast of Antarctica before there was ice. Now here is a redrawing of the map so you can actually see. You can see the coast of Antarctica here, or excuse me, Africa here. On the left side you can see the coast of South America, and on the bottom the coastline of Antarctica before there was ice. And the Air Force cannot explain how this was done. Now, there are some things that you need to understand about this Piri Reis map. It is a genuine document. It is not a hoax. It was made at Constantinople in 1513, AD 1513. It focuses on the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and the northern coast of Antarctica. Piri Reis could not have acquired his information on Antarctica from contemporary explorers of his day because Antarctica remained undiscovered until 1818 AD, more than 300 years after he drew the map. The ice-free coast of Queen Maud Land shown on the map is a colossal puzzle because the geological evidence confirms that the latest date it could have been surveyed and charted in an ice-free condition is 4000 BC. It is not possible to pinpoint the earliest date at which a task could have been accomplished, but it seems that Queen Maud Land may have remained in a stable, unglaciated condition for at least 9,000 years before the spreading ice cap swallowed it entirely. There is no civilization known to history that had the capacity or need to survey the coastline of in the relevant period between 13,000 BC and 4000 BC. So how do we explain? There's an enigma here. What's going on? How did he get this map? Well, he explains to us. He tells us that he was not responsible for the original surveying and cartography. On the contrary, he admits that his role was merely that of a compiler and a copyist, and that the map was derived from a large number of source maps. Some of these had been drawn by contemporary or near-contemporary explorers, including Christopher Columbus, who had by then reached South America and the Caribbean, but others were documents dating back to the 4th century BC or earlier. Piri Reis did not venture any suggestion as to the identity of the cartographers who had produced the earlier maps. In 1963, however, Professor Hapgood proposed a novel and thought-provoking solution to the problem. He argued that some of the source maps the admiral had made use of, in particular, those said to date back to the 4th century BC, had themselves been based on even older sources, which in turn had been based on sources originating in the furthest antiquity. There was, he asserted, irrefutable evidence that the Earth has been comprehensively mapped before 4000 BC by a hitherto unknown and undiscovered civilization which had achieved a high level of technological advancement. It appears, he concluded, that accurate information has been passed down from people to people. It appears that charts must have originated with a people unknown, and they were passed on perhaps by the Minoans and the Phoenicians, who were for 1,000 years and more the greatest sailors of the ancient world. We have evidence that they were collected and studied in the great library of Alexandria in Egypt, and that compilations of them were made by the geographers who worked there. Now, from Alexandria, copies of Hapgood's reconstruction, copies of these compilations and some of the original source maps were transferred to other centers of learning, notably Constantinople. Finally, when Constantinople was seized by the Venetians during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the maps began to find their way into the hands of the European sailors and adventurers. Now, Albert Einstein gives Hapgood a ringing endorsement of his theories of how this could have occurred, which I'll get into in a second. And a later admission of John Wright, who was president of the American Geographical Society, said that Hapgood had posed hypotheses that cry aloud for further testing. However, no further scientific research has ever been undertaken into these anomalous early maps. And there are several. This Piri Reis map is not the only one. There are others also depicting Antarctica from various levels of either no ice at all to partial ice to completely covered in ice. So that Antarctica had then been mapped at various stages of the glacial covering of Antarctica. It had been mapped in the stages. So some maps have it with no ice, some maps have it with a little ice, and some maps have it with total ice covered. Moreover, from being applauded for making a serious new contribution to the debate about the antiquity of human civilization, Hapgood, until his death, was cold-shouldered by the majority of his professional peers. who couched their discussion of his work in what has accurately been described as thick and unwarranted sarcasm, selecting trivia and factors not subject to verification as the basis for condemnation, seeking in this way to avoid the basic issues. And this is just like what they did to Velikovsky. Conventional scientific thinking states, as far as the progression of this Earth, that everything has gone along in a slow rate, the same. That there's been no huge cataclysmic events hit this Earth, and Velikovsky proves that there was, but yet he was shunned by all the scientists of his day. That's another story altogether. Now, Albert Einstein was one of the first to realize Hapgood's contribution when he took the unprecedented step of contributing the foreword to a book Hapgood wrote in 1953, some years before he began his investigation into the Piri Reis Map. And Albert Einstein said this. He said, "I frequently receive communications from people who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas." Einstein observed, "It goes without saying that these ideas are very seldom possessed of scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and if it continues to prove itself of great importance to everything that's related to the history of the Earth's surface." Now, the idea that was expressed in Hapgood's 1953 book is a global geological theory which elegantly explains how and why large parts of Antarctica could have remained ice-free until 4000 BC, together with many other anomalies of Earth science. In brief, his arguments is this. Number one, Antarctica was not always covered with ice and was at one time much warmer than it is today. Number two, it is warm because it was not physically located at the South Pole in that period. Instead, it was approximately 2,000 miles further north, and that would have put it outside the Antarctic Circle in a temperate or cold temperate climate. Number three, the continent moved to its present position inside the Antarctic Circle as a result of a mechanism known as Earth crust displacement. This mechanism, not to be confused with plate tectonics or continental drift, is one whereby the lithosphere, the whole outer crust of the Earth, may be displaced at times, moving over the soft inner body. Much like the skin of an orange, if it were loose, might shift over the inner part of the orange all in one piece. Number four, during the envisaged southwards movement of Antarctica, brought about by Earth crust displacement, the continent would gradually have grown colder, an ice cap forming, and remorselessly expanding over several thousands of years until it attained its present dimensions. Now, Hapgood's theory raises many questions. The most important of what conceivable mechanism would be able to exert sufficient thrust on the lithosphere to precipitate a phenomenon of such magnitude as crustal displacement. And Einstein himself gives us the solution to when he summarized his findings, Hapgood's findings. He said, "In a polar region," this is Einstein, "in a polar region, there is a continual deposition of ice which is not symmetrically distributed about the pole. The Earth's rotation acts on these unsymmetrically deposited masses and produces centrifugal momentum that's transmitted to the rigid crust of the Earth. The constantly increasing centrifugal momentum produced in this way will, when it has reached a certain point, produce a movement of the Earth's crust over the rest of the Earth's body." The Piri Reis Map seems to contain surprising collateral evidence in support of this thesis. The thesis of a geologically recent glaciation of parts of Antarctica following a sudden southward displacement of the Earth's crust. Moreover, since a map could only have been drawn prior to 4000 BC, its implications for the history of human civilization are staggering. Prior to the 4000 BC, there are supposed to have been no civilizations at all. The academic consensus, the traditions, traditionally what the academicians would tell us is that the civilization first developed in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. This development began after 4000 BC and culminated in the emergence of the earliest true civilizations in Sumer and Egypt around 3000 BC, soon followed by the Indus Valley in China. About 1500 years later, civilization took off spontaneously and independently in the Americas. Since 3000 BC in the Old World and about 1500 BC in the New, civilization has steadily evolved in the direction of ever more refined, complex, and productive forms. It's a status where they say everything progresses just a little by little. Mountains raise, the valleys come up. That there's never been anything severe happen to this earth. But the evidence of this Piri Reis map contradicts all of this. Now, the source maps that Piri Reis used to draw up his 1513 map were in all probability located originally in the Imperial Library at Constantinople, to which the admiral is known to have enjoyed privileged access. Those sources either no longer exist or have not been found yet. It was, however, in the library of the old Imperial Palace at Constantinople that the Piri Reis map was rediscovered, painted on a gazelle skin, and rolled up on a dusty shelf as recently as 1929. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures of the other maps. We have the Orontius Phineas map showing Antarctica with ice-free coasts, mountains, and rivers. And that's the Orontius Phineas map. Then we have a Mercator map, and all these are ancient maps that prove Antarctica had been mapped at various times during the ice cap's evolution. The Mercator map shows Antarctica's mountains and rivers covered with ice, and that's the Mercator map. The autofocus just ain't working. Alright. See what that looks like. Any better? And then we have the Bosch map, or Boucher map, with land masses which show Antarctica very much as it would have looked before it became covered with ice. And here's all four maps redrawn, showing at various stages of the ice cap being evolving over Antarctica. Now, is it possible that a human civilization sufficiently advanced to have mapped Antarctica could have developed by 13 BC and later disappeared? And if so, how much later? Because we're just discovering this stuff. We only rediscovered Antarctica in 1818. Before that, There's early Russian maps don't show Antarctica at all. They didn't know it was there. You know, it's so cold down there that when the explorers were exploring the world, the further south they went, it got cold. They probably didn't want to stay, so they didn't go no further. They didn't go far enough to discover Antarctica. But somebody did way back then. Now, Charles Hapgood submitted his collection of ancient maps to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for evaluation by Professor Richard Strawn. The general conclusion was obvious, but he wanted to know precisely what level of mathematics would have been required to draw up the original source documents. On 18th of April 1965, Strawn replied that a very high level of mathematics would indeed would have been necessary. Not only did these maps express latitudes, which was fairly easy for them to determine in their day, but longitudes. Longitudes was very hard, and until a perfect timepiece was invented, we only recently were able to figure out longitudinal lines. But yet these maps incorporated that knowledge. So somebody way back when knew how this Earth was shaped. They knew how to divide it with longitude and latitude, and they did it accurately. Strawn's impression that the maps, through generations of copyists, revealed the handiwork of an ancient, mysterious, and technologically advanced civilization. This was shared by the reconnaissance experts from the U.S. Air Force, which I read you their letter. Lorenzo Burrows, chief of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron's Cartographic Section at Westover Air Force Base, made a particularly close study of the Orontius Phineas map. He concluded that some of the sources upon which it was based must have been drawn up by means of a projection similar to the modern quartiform projection. This, said Burroughs, suggests the use of advanced mathematics. Further, the shape given to the Antarctic continent suggests the possibility, if not the probability, that the original source maps were compiled on a stereographic or mnemonic type of projection involving the use of spherical trigonometry. We are convinced that the findings made by you and your associates are valid and that they raise extremely important questions affecting geology and ancient history. Now, there was another discovery that Hapgood made. There was a Chinese map, copied from an earlier original on a stone pillar in AD 1137. This map incorporates precisely the same kind of high-quality information about the longitudes as the others. It has a similar grid and was drawn up with the benefit of spherical trigonometry. Indeed, on close examination, it shares so many features with the European and Middle Eastern maps that only one explanation seems adequate, and that they must have stemmed from a common source. Now, going on, he goes into the Nazca Lines on the Nazca Plateau in Peru. Now, here's a drawing of all the Nazca Lines. There are many. These are giant drawings on the plateau in Peru. And whoever did this, you cannot even see these things. Pause. Carrying on now, we're talking about the Nazca Lines in Peru on the Nazca Plateau. This plateau, they've created these giant figures of animals, whales, monkeys, hummingbirds, heron. Just some awesome geometric lines, straight arrow lines all over this plateau. Miles long, some of these lines. And these figures are just so giant you cannot even tell what they are from the surface. How they created them is they scraped the darker color volcanic rock off the surface and exposed the lighter color underneath. Now, and the area is with the rainfall in the area, the wind in the area. It's a perfect place to create these things, and the lines just would last forever because there's just no rain, and the wind is with the heat coming off this plateau. It creates a barrier for wind that's it helps to preserve all this stuff. So it's a perfect place to create these things, but these things are so giant. No one knows how they did it without having some kind of aircraft to look down. And that's the same thing with many areas of the world. A lot of these things just could not have been created unless you could actually view them from above as you're creating them. So it's very interesting that these things are so old and yet seem to have required flight in order to construct these things. Now, the people around the Nazca area say that they were not the work of men, but of demigods, the Viracochas, who also left their fingerprints elsewhere in the Andean region many thousands of years ago. Now, experts have pronounced the antiquity of Nazca, basing their opinions on fragments of pottery found embedded in the lines and on radiocarbon results of various organic remains unearthed there. The dates conjectured range between 350 BC and AD 600. Realistically, those dates tell us nothing about the age of the lines themselves, which are inherently as undatable as the stones cleared to make them. All we can say for sure is that the most recent are at least 1,400 years old, but it's theoretically possible that they could be far more ancient than that, for the simple reason that the artifacts from which such dates are derived could have been brought to Nazca by later peoples. So peoples have seen it and just happened to drop pottery or something there, and that's how scientists are so stupid. They don't even take in consideration things like that. But anyways, there are a lot of interesting aspects about these lines. How sophisticated were these Nazcan primitives? What kind of knowledge must they have possessed to inscribe their gigantic signatures on the plateau? It seems for a start that they are pretty good observational astronomers. At least according to Dr. Phyllis Petluga, an astronomer with the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. After making an intensive computer-aided study of stellar alignments at Nazca, she has concluded that the famous spider figure was devised as a terrestrial diagram of the giant constellation of Orion, and that the arrow straight lines linked to the figure appear to have been set out to track through the ages the changing declinations of the three stars of Orion's belt. And here we have a direct correlation between Orion, the three stars of Orion's belt, the three kings, exactly the same as Giza. And, you know, here we got on the opposite side of the world, the spider here, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, that depicts the same thing. These the stars of Orion's belt, and with the straight lines, which would set out to track through the ages the changing declinations of the three stars of Orion's belt. And like we showed earlier, in my pyramid talk, the Egyptians designed the Giza Plateau, the three pyramids of the Giza Plateau, to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. but also in relation to the Orion and the Milky Way, as far as the Giza pyramids and the Nile. It was designed to correlate to a time when Orion's belt was at a place next to the Milky Way that designated what they call the first time in around 10,450 BC. It just blows you away the way that these ancient peoples were able to not only know astronomy, not only know and be able to discern times and dates as far as when this Giza plateau was either designed at that time or designed to point to that time. And the same thing with this Nazca spider. But the spider's also different. It depicts something else. Now, this Nazca spider depicts a member of a known spider genus called Ricinulei. This, as it happens, is one of the rarest spider genres in the world. So rare indeed that it has only been found in remote and inaccessible parts of the Amazon rainforest. How did these supposedly primitive Nazcan artists travel so far from their homeland, crossing the formidable barrier of the Andes, to obtain a specimen? And more to the point, why should they have wanted to do such a thing, and how were they able to duplicate minute details of that spider's anatomy normally visible under a microscope? Notably, the reproductive organ positioned on the end of its extended right leg. This spider, I'll show a picture. Alright, this is the spider, and if you look, that one leg extends off to the right. That is the reproductive organ of this spider. Now, that reproductive organ on its foot, which is kind of funny in itself, but that reproductive organ, it can only be seen under a microscope. Yet these ancients knew it was there. They knew this spider, and they used it and also mirrored Orion with its design. It just boggles the mind how they did this. There are so many other indications on that Nazca Plateau. It's uncanny how they did this, how they could do it without having been able to see it. Now, either they were able to fly at one point and could see their construction progress and show them what they needed to do to design these things and to carve them out of the plateau, or it's possible that before the flood, the Bible talks of a canopy above the earth, a firmament with water above and water below, and this canopy, which would allow the pre-antediluvian peoples to live so long, would also provide almost a mirror that they could see their work progress. So it could have been done a couple different ways. But these are just some things that just boggles the mind of how these ancients were able to do such things and how they had the knowledge to accomplish these things. Now, going on past the Nazca, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Lake Titicaca and the city of Tiahuanaco. Now, Lake Titicaca is some 12,500 feet above sea level. It covers an area of 3,200 square miles and was 138 miles long by 70 miles wide. It was deep, almost reaching 1,000 feet in places, and it has a puzzling geographical history. now that it's more than 2 miles above sea level. But Lake Titicaca is littered with millions upon millions of fossilized seashells. It suggests that at some stage, the whole of the Altiplano was forced upwards from the seabed, perhaps as part of the general terrestrial rising that formed South America as a whole. In the process, great quantities of ocean water, together with countless myriads of living marine creatures, were scooped up and suspended among the Andean ranges. This is thought to have happened not more recently than about 100 million years ago. Paradoxically, despite the mighty antiquity of this event, Lake Titicaca has remained, until the present day, a marine ichthyophauna. In other words, though now located hundreds of miles from any ocean, its fish and crustacea feature many oceanic rather than freshwater types. Surprising creatures brought to the surface in fishermen's nets have included examples of hippocampus, which is a seahorse. In addition, the various species of Alacorestes and other examples of marine fauna leave no doubt that this lake in other periods was much saltier than today, or more accurately, that water which formed it was from the sea and that it was dammed up and locked in the Andes when the continent rose. So much then for the events that may have created Lake Titicaca in the first place. Since its formation, this great interior sea and the Altiplano itself has undergone several other drastic and dramatic changes. Of these, by far the most notable is that the lake's extent appears to have fluctuated enormously, indicated by the existence of an ancient strand line visible on much of the surrounding terrain. Puzzlingly, this strand line is not level but slopes markedly from north to south over a considerable horizontal distance. At the northernmost point surveyed, it is as much as 290 feet higher than Lake Titicaca, and some 400 miles further south is 274 feet lower than the present level of the lake. So what's happened is the lake has tilted over time. You have ancient shoreline that shows on one end of the lake 270 feet higher. You can see where that shoreline was. But down at the other end of the lake is 274 feet lower than the current level. So the actual position of that lake has tilted. The whole lake has tilted. The land has tilted, which caused these lines to show as they do. Much harder to explain, however, given the long time periods for this transformations, is irrefutable evidence that the city of Tiahuanaco was once a port, complete with extensive docks, positioned right on the shore of Lake Titicaca. The problem is that Tiahuanaco's ruins are now marooned about 12 miles south of the lake and more than 100 feet higher than the present shoreline. In the period since the city was built, it therefore follows that one of two things must have happened. Either the level of the lake has fallen greatly, or the land on which Tiahuanaco stands has risen comparably. Either way, it's obvious that there have been massive and traumatic physical changes. Some of these, such as the rise of the Altiplano from the floor of the ocean, certainly took place in remote geological ages before the advent of human civilization. Others are not nearly so ancient and must have occurred after the construction of Tiahuanaco. The question, therefore, is when was Tiahuanaco built? The orthodox historical view is that the ruins cannot possibly be dated much earlier than AD 500. An alternative chronology also exists, however, which, although not accepted by the majority of scholars, seems to be more in tune with the scale of the geological upheavals that have occurred in this region. Based on the mathematical and astronomical calculations of Professor Arthur Poznanski of the University of La Paz, and of Professor Rolf Mueller, who also challenged the official dating of Machu Picchu, which is dates back to antiquity and also uses the same kind of construction techniques that they did in Egypt with some of these giant blocks. It pushes the main phase of the construction of Tiahuanaco back to 15,000 BC. This chronology also indicates that the city later suffered immense destruction in a phenomenal natural catastrophe around the 11th millennium BC, and thereafter rapidly became separated from the lake shore. There's aspects in Tiahuanaco, just like at the pyramid complex of Giza, that points to a date of 15,000 BC, certain astronomical alignments that would occur then, and that has to do with the obliquity of the ecliptic. Now, it's kind of a weird thing to try and comprehend, but the obliquity of the ecliptic has to do with a 41,000 year cycle through which the terrestrial equator, or the celestial equator, is merely an imaginary extension of the Earth's equator into the celestial sphere. It also lies at an angle to the orbital plane. The Earth is tilted just a little bit off straight in its cycle around the sun, and the celestial equator then is a certain angle compared to our equator, and that is called the obliquity of the ecliptic. They know that the lineup in Tiahuanaco was designed at a time when the obliquity of the ecliptic at a point when it was around 15,000 BC. So either it was designed to point to that date, or that's when the actual construction was made. Pretty awesome stuff for these primitives who apparently didn't know nothing. At least that's what we're traditionally told. And this book just goes on and on with place after place, and I'm only going to go through a few of them. If you go to 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City in Teotihuacan, you have a layout of an area that also points to a astronomy and lineups within astronomy. You have a place called the Street of the Dead going, which is a street going all the way down through the middle of these pyramids, and let's see. It was surprising that the architects who had planned Teotihuacan had deliberately chosen to incline the Street of the Dead 15 degrees 30 minutes east of north. There are several theories as to why this eccentric orientation had been selected, but none was especially convincing. Growing numbers of scholars, however, are beginning to wonder whether astronomical alignments might have been involved. One, for example, proposed that the Street of the Dead might have been built to face the setting of the Pleiades at a time when it was constructed. Another, Professor Gerald Hawkins, has suggested that a Sirius Pleiades axis could have also played a part. And Stansbury Hagar at the Department of Ethnology at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences had suggested that the street might represent the Milky Way. So here on the other side of the globe, you have interesting Sirius Pleiades, which I had talked about, the Great Pyramid, that points to the Pleiades. The scored lines points to the Pleiades, and the air passages or the the channels, not really air passages, but the channels pointed to Sirius. So on two sides of the world, and also with the alignment with the Milky Way. So on two sides of the world, you have ancient peoples trying to say the same thing, pointing to these same points in the sky. And once you get into the Gospel in the Stars, which we'll get into at another time, this all starts to make sense why they would do this, because Sirius represents Christ. The Pleiades is a type of the church. It's all just blows you away that they was able to do all this. Now, in Teotihuacan, there is a pyramid there called the Pyramid of the Sun. Now, this Pyramid of the Sun, just as the Great Pyramid of Giza, the height of the pyramid in relation to the base perimeter of the pyramid, the base times 2 pi, or the height times 2 pi equals the base perimeter. And this Pyramid of the Sun, almost exactly like the Great Pyramid, except it uses 4 pi. This pyramid's shorter, half the height of the Great Pyramid, and the perimeter of it in relation to its height represents 4 pi. So you have the knowledge of pi represented in these ancients, just as you did at the Giza Plateau, but here we're in Mexico. These things just boggle the mind. How in the world were these ancient people able to do these things? But once you understand that there was an advanced knowledge going on, if you was to live 900 years like Adam, your knowledge could be, it increases exponentially. Once you get so far, it just keeps going. And the Bible says that man was once very smart and lost it. And that's why they had to preserve monuments around the world to preserve this ancient knowledge. And that's exactly what has happened. So the ancients had to preserve the knowledge so that at a later point, when we were to get smart enough, like we're just now getting to this point now, we were able to understand that these ancients were trying to preserve this knowledge for a future generation that would be able to know and understand these things. Now, I'm not going to get into the Great Pyramid, but I do want to get into the Sphinx today. If I can find it. The Sphinx has weathering patterns that are not wind related. Now, so getting into the Sphinx, Egypt. I'm reading now from chapter 47, the same book. This Fingerprints of the Gods, Graham Hancock. Y'all should get it. It's wonderful. It blows you away. Egyptologists, said John West, are the last people in the world to address any anomaly. Of course, there are many anomalies in Egypt. The one West was referring to at that moment, however, was the anomaly of the 4th dynasty pyramids. An anomaly because of what had happened during the 3rd, 5th, and 6th dynasties. Dzoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, supposedly of the 3rd dynasty, was an imposing edifice, but it was built with relatively small, manageable blocks that 5 or 6 men working together could carry, and its internal chambers were structurally unsound. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties, although adorned inside with beautiful pyramid texts, were so poorly built and had collapsed so completely that today most of them amount to little more than mounds of rubble. The 4th dynasty pyramids at Giza, however, were wonderfully made and had endured the passage of thousands of years more or less intact. It was this sequence of events, or rather its implications, that West felt Egyptologists should have paid more attention to. There is a discrepancy in the scenario that reads, building kind of rubbishly built pyramids that are structurally unsound, and then suddenly building absolutely unbelievable pyramids that are structurally the most incredible things ever conceived of, and then immediately afterwards going back to structurally unsound pyramids. It doesn't make sense. A parallel scenario would be in the auto industry that they, for instance, would invent and build the Model T Ford, and then suddenly inventing and building the 93 Porsche and making a few of those, and then forgetting how to do that and going back to building Model T Fords again. Civilizations don't work this way. So what are you saying, I ask? Are you saying that the 4th dynasty periods weren't built by the 4th dynasty at all? My gut feeling is that they weren't. They don't look like the mastabas in front of them. They don't look like any other 4th dynasty stuff either. They don't seem to fit in, and nor does the Sphinx. But the big difference is that we don't have to rely on gut feelings where the Sphinx is concerned. We can prove that it was built long before the 4th dynasty. And I also proved in talking about the Great Pyramid at the Giza complex, even the 3 that are there, that when they attribute the building of the Great Pyramid to Khufu, that was a forgery. So, and Khufu was never buried there. The inventory stela tells us he was not buried there, and that the Great Pyramid had existed in his day already. But we're talking about the Sphinx right now. A great civilization must have preceded the vast movements of water that passed over Egypt, which leads us to assume that the Sphinx had already existed, sculptured in the rock on the west cliff at Giza. That Sphinx, whose leonine body, except for the head, shows indisputable signs of water erosion. Now, traditionally, the Sphinx is supposed to have been built by Khafre around 2500 BC. But since the beginning of dynastic times, say 3000 BC onwards, there just hasn't been enough rain on the Giza Plateau to have caused the very extensive erosion that we see all over the Sphinx's body. You really have to go back to before 10,000 BC to find a wet enough climate in Egypt to account for the weathering of this type on this scale. It therefore follows that the Sphinx must have been built before 10,000 BC, and since it's a massive sophisticated work of art, it also follows that it must have been built by a high civilization. The key issue turns out to be the deep trench that the monument was surrounded by on all sides. Because the Sphinx is set in a hollow, West explained, sand piles up to its neck within a few decades if it's left unattended. It has been left untended often during historical times. In fact, through a combination of textual references and historical extrapolations, it's possible to prove that during the 4,500 years that have lapsed since it was ostensibly built by Khafre, it has been buried to its neck for as much as 3,300 years. That means that in all this time, there has only been a cumulative total of over 1,000 years in which its body has been susceptible to wind erosion. All the rest of the time, it has been protected from the desert winds by an enormous blanket of sand. The point is that if the Sphinx was really built by Khafre in the Old Kingdom, And if wind erosion was capable of inflicting such damage on it in such a short time span, then either the Old Kingdom structures in the area built of the same limestone ought to show similar weathering, but none of them do. Absolutely unmistakable Old Kingdom tombs full of hieroglyphs and inscriptions, none of them show the same type of weathering as the Sphinx. The weathering of the Sphinx and of the walls of its surrounding rock-hewn enclosure had not been caused by wind scaring at all, but by thousands of years of heavy rainfall, long ages before the Old Kingdom came into being. Having won over his professional peers at the 1992 convention of the Geological Society of America, Schloch went on to explain his findings to a much wider and more eclectic audience, including Egyptologists, at the 1992 annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. He began by pointing out to delegates that the body of the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx ditch are deeply weathered and eroded. This erosion is a couple of meters thick in places. At least on the walls, it is very deep. It is very old, in my opinion, and gives a rolling and undulating profile. Such undulations are easily recognizable by the stratigraphers, and paleontologists as having been caused by precipitation-induced weathering. This weathering takes the distinct form of a combination of deep vertical fissures and undulating horizontal coves. A classic textbook example, in Schloch's words, of what happens to limestone structures when you have a rain beating down on it for thousands of years. It is clearly rain precipitation that produced these erosional features. Wind or sand erosion presents a very different profile of sharp-edged horizontal channels selectively scoured out from the softer layers of the affected rock. Under no circumstances can it cause the vertical fissures particularly visible in the wall of the Sphinx enclosure. These could only have been formed by water running down the wall, the result of rain falling in enormous quantities cascading over the slope of the Giza Plateau and down on the Sphinx enclosure below. It picked out the weak spots in the rock. Schloch elaborated and opened them up into these fissures. Clear evidence to me as a geologist that the erosional features was caused by rainfall. Now, Schloch was not the first geologist to have noticed the anomalous precipitation-induced weathering features on the core body of the Sphinx. He was, however, the first to have become involved in public debates over the immense historical implications of this weathering. His attitude was that he preferred to stick to his geology. And this is his quote: "I've been told over and over again that the peoples of Egypt, as far as we know, did not either have the technology or the social organization to cut out the core body of the Sphinx in pre-dynastic times. However, I don't see it as being my problem as a geologist. I'm not seeking to shift the burden. It's really up to the Egyptologists and the archaeologists to figure out who carved it. If my findings are in conflict with their theory about the rise of civilization, then maybe it's time for them to reevaluate their theory. I'm not saying that the Sphinx was built by the Atlanteans or people from Mars or extraterrestrials. I'm just following the science where it leads me, and it leads me to conclude that the Sphinx was built much earlier than previously thought." And I had a picture of this weathering of the Sphinx. And another good picture right here. Now, we also talked about the Giza Plateau, the pyramids at Giza, being the complex at Giza was designed to point to a date at 10,450 BC. Either the area was built at that time or planned out at that time and completed at a later date. But the 10,450 BC is a date in which the Great Pyramid complex, that Giza complex, was designed to align with Orion's belt and the Milky Way. So on both sides of the world, we have indications that this stuff goes way, way back to a time before mankind was traditionally civilization was supposed to exist, but yet the intelligence depicted in these things is far greater than what the Egyptologists had. So think about these things now. As far as you traditional, what the church would traditionally tell us about this world being 4004 BC, or just before that, it being created, these things fly out the window. And the church needs to be able to talk about these things, to discuss these things, and to come up with reasonable explanations as to how these things could have existed. But not only do you have in Genesis, between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, a eons of time could have existed between those two verses. But before, in Genesis 1, when God created the heavens and the earth, and then later the earth became waste and desolation, Jeremiah sees this earth with no Adam, and yet there were meeting places of intelligent beings. The word is cities in Jeremiah, but the actual word means meeting places of intelligent beings. We know that Lucifer was in the garden before he fell, and yet when Adam was created, Lucifer had already rebelled. He was already in his fallen state. So what happened in prehistory and pre-Adam Adamic times is up in the air. No one knows. So, but we need to be able to give answers to the children these days when they learn about these truths, when they learn about civilizations that had the ability to create these monuments, to create these things. We got to have answers for them, and that's what all this is about. This is to show that these things existed, and to show that the Bible don't have to be thrown out just because it goes against some of your traditions, because it goes against some of your what you've been traditionally taught. What we need to do then is reread the Bible in light of the evidences that we have, and we can fully understand what God intends us to know. This world's been around a long time. Mankind's been around a long time, and someone way back then was extremely intelligent. Think about these things, and we'll talk again. You all have a wonderful day. Blessings to you all.